Hey guys, welcome to Braddels Gaming and to today's discussion video, which is centered around a particularly disappointing subject. That is, that Far Cry 6 will have no arcade and subsequently map editor. Now this is no longer fresh news, this is something that we as the Far Cry community have basically known since the beginning of June, when during a Far Cry 6 Reddit AMA on the 1st of June, Far Cry 6's game director Alexander Latendra, known as Alex in the forum for short, answered a question by Danny on PC regarding if the map editor would make its return in Far Cry 6. Alex fundamentally declined the notion of a map editor in Far Cry 6, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the development team removed the arcade mode to focus more on the game's campaign. The reason I'm so late to the party on this issue was just a few weeks to wrap my head around this news and what I would do with my channel now, and then writing up what I considered to be a comprehensive and understandable video script for this discussion video, which has actually taken me a whole month to do, plus producing the video itself, which thankfully only took 1 week to do. Nonetheless, I still feel it's very important to reignite this discussion, even now, given the wide repercussions it has on Far Cry 6 and the wider Far Cry community. Now in the background I've got various Far Cry 5 arcade gameplay from my Far Cry 5 community creation series, just so the video is a little more engaging, and I thought it would be an appropriate background since that's what the video pretty much revolves around, the map editor and arcade. Be sure to check these maps out in full via my Far Cry 5 Community Creations channel playlist, where you'll be able to gain a deeper appreciation of these people's maps and the details of how you can play them yourselves. Now the exact quote from Alex from Ubisoft would have shortly flicked up on your screen at the beginning of the video, but what I want to point to later on in this video is a deeper analysis of this quote, as if you take a closer look, you might or might not see a degree of crypticness in Alex's response to Danny. This is one of the topics I will be discussing, but I will also briefly talk about topics related to the absence of this feature in Far Cry 6, such as how this has impacted the Far Cry community, Ubisoft itself, an opportunity we may have as the Far Cry community to sway Ubisoft on this issue, and on Far Cry 6's longevity. Before discussing what I think is some apparent crypticness in Alex's response to Danny, let's first look at how this news has affected the Far Cry community. Like how a nuclear blast would produce massive shockwaves that would shoot out on impact. This news has sent shockwaves of its own through the Far Cry community, with everyone I've seen commenting on online platforms or personally chatted to disappointed with this startling admission. I have seen an insane amount of backlash and disappointment on Reddit, YouTube, and Xbox clubs regarding Ubisoft's decision to drop the map editor and arcade altogether. Generally, the consensus I've seen from a lot of Far Cry fans out there has been that they will not buy the game unless Ubisoft decides to either introduce it in Far Cry 6 at a later date, that is the map editor, or alternatively announce that they are developing a standalone Far Cry arcade/map editor game, a concept that has already been rumored for some time. Now I'm not sure what this general discontentment will have in terms of a direct impact on Far Cry 6's sales. I still feel the game is going to be bought up by a large sum of people, and this is especially true if you play the Far Cry games purely for the campaign, which I think a lot of people still do. The campaign still looks very promising, and the world of Yara looks like an epic playground to do battle against Anton Castillo's oppressive government regime, but if I were Ubisoft, I would ensure to drop the price tag of Far Cry 6, as taking away such a beloved feature that has been a staple of its franchise since the beginning is sure to hurt its reputation. But on an even more ethical level, charging people the same amount of money as previous numbered Far Cry incarnations would just be plain wrong, particularly given all those previous numbered Far Cry incarnations had map editors. Ubisoft dropped the price tag of Far Cry New Dawn for this very reason, and all their other in-between titles, so I think it would be remiss if they didn't offer the game at a discounted rate, especially now that the campaign will be the standalone feature of the game. Now let's take a look at what I consider to be some crypticness surrounding Alex's answer in Far Cry 6's Reddit AMA regarding the map editor and arcade. And I thought this would be important to bring up, as it does make for a very interesting discussion. Up on the screen now you can see the full exchange between the questioner, Danny on PC, and the answerer, Alex from Ubisoft. It's worth noting that Alex does not give a direct answer to Danny regarding the map editor, instead choosing to say no to the arcade returning, but not directly answering the question, which was if the map editor would be returning. And so that's led to some people thinking, oh, well, maybe there will be an editor. But I kind of think that that's not really the case for the following reasons. The first reason is that whilst the map editor and arcade are different things, they've always been packaged together. Even though you can rightly argue that the map editor and the arcade are a different thing, it's important to note that the map editor is a part of the arcade, despite it being a separate thing. In essence, the arcade mode is a managerial area where the game combines all of its community-based features into the same place. For example, to access the map editor in Far Cry 5, you have to navigate down the main menu and select the arcade option first. So, whilst the arcade and the editor are technically two different things, when someone says the arcade, they are generally referring to not only the map editor, the map browser, or whatever community-based feature, but is simply combining all of these community-based features together under one banner, just like how Ubisoft has done in Far Cry 5 with its arcade mode. Reinforcing this point is the notion that it's essentially impossible to have a map editor in a Far Cry game without a managerial system such as the arcade and vice versa. For example, if Far Cry 6 had a map editor, but no platform such as the arcade to publish maps on and play them, it would totally defeat the purpose of having a map editor in the first place. If everybody could access a map editor in Far Cry 6, but with no means to publish their creations, the novelty of playing around with the Far Cry 6 assets would sure be cool at first, but would quickly wear off almost immediately after the game launched, as players would naturally have little to no motivation to build anything worthwhile, as any amount of effort they put into a map or creation would simply be wasted, as other players would not be able to view, play, and appreciate their creative feats. Now I make these two clarifications because it may suggest why Alex answered Danny with no, arcade will not come back. Because arcade essentially encompasses the map editor, and it would be a ridiculous notion to have a map editor but no managerial system such as the arcade, I feel Alex's intention was probably just to condense his response. By saying arcade will not come back, Alex was referring to the whole arcade experience, including the map editor. Although, I personally, to avoid any confusion, would have just said, no, the arcade mode, which includes the map editor, will not return to Far Cry 6. Not only would this directly answer Danny on PC's question about the map editor more specifically, but would also make Alex's response a whole lot clearer, which would allow us as a Far Cry community to see and acknowledge his feature's sad removal in Far Cry 6 more clearly. Now the third and final reason for why I believe there is sadly no hidden message in Alex's somewhat cryptic response actually targets a specific counter-argument to all that I have already discussed. This counter-argument makes the case that because Far Cry 5 is the only Far Cry game where the community-based area is termed arcade, that perhaps a similar mode to the arcade that includes a map editor will return in Far Cry 6, but under an alternative name. The key discernment to make here though, in dispelling this counter-argument, is differentiating the arcade as a mode or feature as opposed to the name of Far Cry 5's community-based area. In other words, we shouldn't make the assumption that Alex is cryptically conveying the return of the arcade in Far Cry 6 under a different guise, because Alex himself is actually the one that differentiates the arcade as a mode instead of the name. The reason why it's not clear is because Alex breaks up the sentence structure in his response. For example, in the first sentence he says, no, arcade will not come back. But then in the second sentence says that removing this mode allowed us to focus our efforts on the main campaign. This means that despite breaking up the two ideas across two sentences instead of linking them in one, Alex is essentially referring to the arcade as a mode, not as the name, and therefore this concludes that the arcade, which encompasses the map editor, will sadly not be making a return, even under a different name. Like I mentioned earlier, all this confusion could have been avoided if Alex simply said, no, the arcade mode, which includes the map editor, will not return to Far Cry 6. This would have better linked the idea that he was referring to the arcade as a mode or feature, which would reduce confusion and allow everyone to make the clear conclusion that 1. The arcade mode, including the map editor, will not return, and 2. That Alex is referring to the arcade as a mode, and not the term exclusive to the Far Cry 5 game title. Later in his response, Alex yields the confession that removing this mode was a difficult decision, and communicates the reason behind the removal of this mode was to allow the development team to focus their efforts on the campaign. Raising the campaign in the response I feel is the final nail in the coffin, because by mentioning the campaign, Alex is essentially giving us the reason for why the arcade mode will not feature in Far Cry 6. Given the campaign is the arcade mode's direct opposite feature, because the campaign is usually played in a single player setting, whilst arcade mode is usually played in a multiple player setting, shows us that Ubisoft removed the arcade mode feature so they could focus on the campaign instead. So not only does Alex make that link that he's referring to the arcade as a mode or feature, but he is also giving us evidence for why the arcade mode was omitted in the first place. Summarizing, whilst it is definitely worth investigating the composition of Alex's somewhat confusing quote more vigorously, I think based on the logic above, it can be confirmed that these creative community-based features are not on Ubisoft's to-do list in developing Far Cry 6, and therefore something we will unfortunately not be seeing in Far Cry's next numbered mainline game. Now what's the opportunity we may have as Far Cry fans to sway Ubisoft on this issue? Well, I think that's actually to come back to Far Cry 5 to fulfill all of your creative map editing and custom map playing urges. Despite the Far Cry arcade being over 3 years old, it still remains largely operational. Many gamers are still playing and enjoying the maps here, and most importantly, map editors from all around the world are continuing to produce amazing new gameplay experiences for players every day. Many people might not remember, but in April 2019, a full year after the release of Far Cry 5 and 7 months since the last update for Far Cry 5, update 1.11 in September 2018, Ubisoft released a new update for Far Cry 5, update 1.12, which was brought into the game to fix a few minor graphical issues after an increase in the activity on Far Cry 5 because of new interest in the game following the release of Far Cry 5's direct sequel, Far Cry New Dawn. But why am I mentioning this? Because it shows that Ubisoft, despite originally and prematurely stopping updates for Far Cry 5 to work on other games, actually came back to Far Cry 5 and released a new update for it, following a spike in player numbers. This new interest obviously didn't last long enough for Ubisoft to make the decision to return to Far Cry 5 and release new updates for it again, but I think it's important to highlight this, as it shows a previous moment in gaming history when Far Cry fans, indirectly, were able to convince Ubisoft to return to a game they had otherwise stopped releasing new updates for. Now I'm not necessarily saying that if every Far Cry fan jumped back onto Far Cry 5 this week, that Ubisoft would come back to this game and start releasing new updates and content again, but what this may do is change Ubisoft's perception of the arcade and its multifaceted potential that everybody I've seen or played with in the Far Cry community seems to understand, but not Ubisoft itself. This is both an indirect and innovative method we can use to convey to Ubisoft our want to see the arcade mode return to the Far Cry franchise, whether this be in the form of a standalone Far Cry map editor arcade game, and or a small team from Ubisoft coming back to Far Cry 5 to release new free map editor content and bug fix updates for it again. The most unfortunate thing about all this though, is that here within the Braddels gaming community, we're only a small channel and therefore an even smaller sub-community within the Far Cry community. This means that the exposure this video receives, and the idea presented before those of you watching to this point in the video, is probably going to be incredibly low, and therefore this idea may never go into fruition. In fact, I know it won't unless this video somehow miraculously blows up and the viewer retention is extremely high. Come on YouTube algorithm, do it for the sake of Far Cry! Although, not to fret, I will be making a shorter follow-up video in relation to this idea, in the hope that more people become aware of it, so that it has a stronger chance of becoming reality. Nonetheless, I still want to implore everyone watching this video to jump back on the Far Cry arcade, give it the love it deserves, and maybe, just maybe, Ubisoft will see how much we want this mode to come back. Now, let's finish this video on Far Cry 6's longevity. I think the simple answer is that taking away the arcade mode hurts Far Cry 6's longevity. Like always, Ubisoft will deliver its usual post-launch roadmap of content, including DLCs and perhaps other campaign expansion packs, with new missions, cosmetics, weapons, vehicles, etc., as it has done in previous Far Cry titles. But the simple fact remains. The arcade is going to leave a huge gap in Far Cry 6, and I predict that once people have finished playing through the campaign, they're going to be looking at other games to play pretty quickly. The reality is that the arcade mode would probably have to be one of the most sustainable game models out there for keeping people playing on a game the longest post-launch. Like I mentioned earlier, there's still so much being made on the Far Cry 5 arcade. Whenever I jump on the arcade, regardless of the specific game mode I pick to play, there's always something new to play, and not just the basic effortless maps, but also top-notch quality ones as well. Every day you play, you experience something new and refreshing. And actually a game that has really capitalized on this idea and maximized this to the highest potential is Minecraft. Now I'm not going to go into the specifics of what has made Minecraft so successful, but in a sentence, Minecraft is basically a game centered around a map editor. There's a reason Minecraft is still being played by millions of people around the world on a weekly basis. Minecraft is that pure example of what happens when you combine the creativity of people with a game that gives you the tools to create anything forever. It therefore still shocks me that Ubisoft have decided to remove the arcade mode in Far Cry 6 just as much as it did when they announced they would stop supporting the Far Cry 5 arcade a mere 6 months after Far Cry 5's initial release date. I've always found Ubisoft's Far Cry campaigns to be quite brilliant, each one having its own individual flair in terms of the world, the gameplay and the story, so I don't see why they felt the need to make as drastic a decision as they have in removing the arcade mode from Far Cry 6, especially since they've already set such a high bar for themselves in their campaigns. It does make me intrigued though about how much the campaign experience will actually improve in Far Cry 6, because despite being confident that the campaign will be fantastic, I feel the added pressure they have now applied to themselves is a very make or break situation. People like me are naturally going to have high expectations for the Far Cry 6 campaign now, especially since the omission of the arcade was, via Alexander Latendra's response, a direct result of the development team's desire to improve the campaign. Now I'm not saying the campaign product is perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's still a very solid product that attracts millions of players each and every entry. But otherwise, that basically covers everything to do with the announcement that Far Cry 6 will not feature an arcade mode and subsequently map editor. But now I want to hear what your thoughts are from this very unoriginal, pun intended, bombshell. What do you think? Is this the end of the map editor era in Far Cry period, or will we see a return to this beloved feature in the far sooner future than we think? Perhaps a standalone arcade and map editor game is secretly in the works, but what about in the immediate future? Will Ubisoft make the decision to bring back this feature in Far Cry 6, or will Far Cry players collectively go back to the Far Cry 5 arcade to fulfill their creative impulses, thus prompting Ubisoft to also go back to Far Cry 5's arcade and release new updates for it again? I'd love to see all this discussion in the comments section down below, but most importantly, I hope you enjoyed this video and that perhaps it has reignited and sparked some thoughts about what you think is next for Ubisoft. Either way, let's make some noise, amplify our community voice, and whilst I respectfully acknowledge that Ubisoft are probably not on the lookout for some Aussie dude's opinions on his small YouTube channel, I feel any noise, no matter how big or how small, is a step in the right direction. Who knows? If we continually let Ubisoft know that we want the arcade editor to return, whether that be by making noise or going back to play the Far Cry 5 arcade in spades, they might just consider it. As I wrap up this video, I just want to say a massive thank you if you've made it this far in the video. You guys obviously have some great austerity to listen to some Aussie dude yap and rant around all day about his disarray and deep-seated concern for Ubisoft and the future of their Far Cry franchise. So, If Far Cry content is something that interests you, especially from an Australian, then please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon, as I have a whole lot more Far Cry content coming your way very soon. So soon, in fact, as I'll be releasing yet another Far Cry discussion video in the next couple of days. That video will also double up as a channel update and will be called How the Far Cry Community Can Bring Ubisoft Back to the Far Cry 5 Arcade. But otherwise, I'm Braddels Gaming, I'm signing out now, and remember to have yourselves a great day.